Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and today's workshop is all about transforming data with JavaScript and transferring it between different REST APIs. This is actually one of the most common use cases in Appsmith when you have to bridge data from multiple systems and you want to just create a single UI to control everything. So for this use case, I'm going to bulk import records to HubSpot contacts using a mock API as that external source. So in your case, it could be pulling contacts from maybe customer sales in Shopify or another e-commerce platform, or maybe you want to pull records from a Google form that's saving values to a Google Sheet. And then you import records from those Google Sheet rows into HubSpot contacts. There's a ton of different use cases, and we support pretty much every database and API. So any third-party data that you want to import into HubSpot, the same approach should work. I'm just going to focus on the contacts and importing from a mock API for this example, but really it could be any data source that you want to use. So let's start out by seeing how to enable the API in HubSpot. We're going to create a private app and then use that to create a bearer token and set the scopes. Once we've got that, then I can save that as a data source in Appsmith and start writing queries to create and list the contacts in HubSpot. All right, let's check it out. Okay, I've got some fake contacts here in my contact section of the HubSpot CRM. I'm using the free version of the CRM, and the API is in the free version, and everything I'm doing in Appsmith as well is all going to be available in the free version if you want to follow along. So for this example, I'm going to be adding new records to the contacts part of the CRM, but this should work with any of the different objects here. So same basic approach for importing data from any API or database into any one of these sections of HubSpot. So the first thing I want to do is enable the API and create a bearer token so I can use that in Appsmith. So start out by going to the settings here in HubSpot. And then under integrations, go to private apps. And you'll want to create a new private app. And you can give it a name. It auto generates a random one here for you. Then for the scopes, make sure you at least choose that contact table or whatever it is that you want to edit. I'm going to give read and write access to the contacts and to there's a sensitive data, like a separate part of the contacts table where they've separated out the sensitive data. And then there's the schema. So you might want this to be able to use the API to get a list of all the values for a certain field. You'll need at least the main one for the object here for contacts just to write data to it. But the schema will let you see that the status field has these 3 drop downs, or what are the allowable values, and those things can help you populate your form and make it to where the user doesn't have to type things out. They just have a drop down. So I'm selecting all those contact things there, and there's a bunch of other scopes, even stuff for the settings of the API and managing your account, but that's all I'm going to add for now. And then there is a webhook section here. This we're not using this today, but just in case you're interested to explain how this works, you put in a URL of somewhere you want to send a webhook every time some event happens in HubSpot. That could be creating a contact or changing their status or deleting or whatever it is. And you can subscribe to those events and then send that webhook somewhere else. So Appsmith does have a workflow feature in the business and enterprise plan, and that could be used to monitor and catch these things and do it automatically. Today, we're going to stick to the features in the free plan, and instead of using the webhook, we're just going to connect to the HubSpot API directly and bridge that with another API, and then be able to transfer data just as you're viewing it, as you select a row and you want to approve it and send it to the next data source. So we're going to set it up to where it's that human in the loop. You've got a person in the middle that's deciding whether or not you want to approve this one or migrate it to the next data source. Whereas the webhook, if you do this, that's going to be automatic every time. So if you're looking for an approach that you can set that up automatically, I would consider using the webhook and either Appsmith's workflow feature or some other workflow tool. But what we're looking at today is to be able to kind of review that stuff, get a list of records from a different API, and then select a row or select them in bulk and send all that to HubSpot. Okay, so that's webhooks. We're not going to mess with that. Make sure you've got the right scopes and you click Create App. I am going to cancel out of this one because I already have one created. But I'll go ahead and show you. You get this warning, you go ahead and create it, and then it'll show you the token. You have to click, show token to see all of it and copy it. So I already have a token set up that I'm going to use, and I've started a data source. So let's go over to Appsmith now. And I've got a empty page of my app here, and you can create a new data source. Go to HubSpot, and then just select bearer token and paste in that token. And like I said, I've already set up my data source, so I don't need to save this one. Just wanted to show you where that's at. And once you have that data source created, then you can start adding queries on top of it, and they'll all have the right authentication. So I've got my data source. Let's see, I've got quite a few in here. Here we go. And so you can start a new API from here while you're viewing the data source, or back in the editor from the query pane here, new API, and then choose the data source. So I want to list the contacts. And if you look here in the commands for the HubSpot API, there are a ton of options. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in here that we're not going to look at today. If you scroll down to the CRM, we're going to be listing objects and creating. So the first query here, I want to list objects from the contacts table, and we'll click run. So there's our results. It's showing the contacts coming back from HubSpot. And first thing you'll notice is that there's this object. It doesn't come back as just an array of records. It comes back as an object that has a results array. And in this case, that's the only thing in this object is the results array. Sometimes, endpoints will have pagination stuff. It'll tell you how many pages there are, how many records total. So in this case, it's pretty simple. We just need that dot results array. And then inside of there, we've got an object for each record. And each one of those has this ID and then properties is another object. So the top level of each row of data is just a couple fields. It's the ID, created, updated, archived, and then properties are all the fields that that you can customize and edit. So we want to show these properties in a table, but if I do that right now, it's going to look a little weird because this is nested. But let's go ahead and do it anyway, just to see what it looks like. So I'm going to drag in a table widget, and we will connect this to our HubSpot query. Now remember, that comes back as a results array inside the .data. So .data is whatever happens to come back from that API. And in this case, it's nesting the records inside that results array. So now we've got that level of it, at least the ID and a couple fields here, and then all of the properties. But this isn't quite how we want to display it. I want to see these properties, and then the extra, like the ID and the created at and whatever, we may or may not want to display that, but the main thing that we need are these nested properties. So first thing that we're going to do for transforming data is just to display it. It's not so much transforming data to migrate from one API to the other. It's just, this is a standard way that APIs will return data for a lot of different services. Airtable does this, where there's the ID and then all of the properties are nested. I think they call it fields instead of properties for Airtable. But a lot of APIs have this data structure that comes back. So what we're going to do is transform this with some JavaScript. So I'll start a new JS object. And just going to get rid of this placeholder code here. So we want a function that will return that same data, but we want to transform it and flatten it. So call this flatten contacts. And first, I'm just going to return that exact same value that's coming back from the list contacts API. And so if I run this, you can see that it returns that object with the results array. So let's drill down to that results. And I'm going to set this to a variable here. So we'll call this the raw data. And then we want to transform this data and get it in a different format. So I'm going to say return raw data.map, and we'll map over this data, and then we can return those properties. So for each row, I want to return the row.properties. Got too many autocompleting there. There it is. Okay, so a couple things are fixed now. It's not an object first, it's an array. And each one of those elements in the array is just a list of key value pairs. So it's flattened, but you'll notice that the ID is right here inside as well as outside of the object. We'll look back at the query here. So here's the properties, and there's HS object ID or HubSpot, and then there's the same ID out here, but it's just called ID. So in this case, the fields that you want are nested, and for convenience, they've duplicated. They've added that ID to the inside of the properties as well, so that you have it all together. This is a little easier to use because you don't have to try to join those two things when you go to put it into a table. Airtable, it has this ID at the top and then fields right here, and they don't put the ID in the middle. So you end up having to try to merge those two things together when you flatten it. And I want to show how to do that just to kind of cover all the different cases here, because you'll probably run across this. So in this case, I'm only returning the properties, and it works because I've got that ID right here. If you needed to add that ID as well, here's how you would do it. So instead of just returning the row.properties right here, going to wrap this in some curly braces. And now that we're doing a multi-line function, we have to use a return. So here I want to return an object that has an ID equal to the row.id. And then we can just take those properties and expand them, use the spread operator. So I want to return an object that has this one property specifically that I'm picking out, and then just unpacking the rest of those properties. So if we run this, you can see that now I'm getting an ID, and it has a duplicate because HubSpot has added that ID for us. But again, Airtable does not. A lot of other APIs use that nested structure, and they don't give you that duplicate ID there in the middle for convenience. So this is how you can merge those together. We can make this a single line function again. So instead of using return an object right here, and we've got these curly brackets around it, what you can do instead, you get rid of the curly brackets that you would use for a multi-line function, get rid of the return. And if you try to just put this object right here, what you'll notice is that it thinks that that's the beginning and end of a function. So it doesn't see this as the outside of an object, it thinks it's a function. If you put parentheses around that, now it'll work. So it's a shorthand notation. Instead of having to say, open function bracket, a return statement, another open bracket for the object, you can get it down to a single line like this. Zoom in here. So arrow function, and then parentheses, and then the object that you want to return. And so that is flattening the data. It's putting that ID in there twice. I'm going to pull that back out now that I've shown you how to do that part. So we just need the properties here. Let's run that one more time. Okay, so back to the table here. Instead of displaying the results coming back from the API directly, so now I'm going to look at the JS object and look at the result of my function here. You can either use the function name .data or call the function. And then what this will do is every time the input data changes, it'll update. It'll show you the difference. So let's run the API. I want a button to actually call that API. Okay, and on click, we will make this run the list contacts. All right, there we go. So I've got the data displayed from HubSpot, and now we want to be able to create a record through the API. So I'm going to add a new query to HubSpot. And this time we're choosing the create object from the CRM section here. And then that object we're creating is contacts again. Okay, and then right here, you put in that properties object. So we can copy that format from the other API. I should name this while I'm here. Create contact. So we'll go back to the list contact, and I can just copy that format right here. That's what goes in the body when you go to create a contact. So I'm going to paste this in here, and I want to wrap all that in double curly brackets. Okay, now we do not need the modified time or the object ID because we're creating one. Don't need the created date, that'll get added automatically. So just to demonstrate how this works, I'm only doing the email and the first and last name. Now, I'm going to run this just to make sure that this much is working before we make it dynamic. So let's just put in a test value here. And we'll run that. Okay, we got back an ID. And if we look back at the CRM section here under the contacts. Okay, so yeah, it created a new record. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. All right, so we can list records from HubSpot and create a new one. But it is creating a hard-coded one. I just typed in the values there, and it's going to create the same contact every time right now. So the next thing we want to do is make this dynamic and pass in values from another API. I'm going to use a mock API just to keep things simple and focus on the data transformation and sending it to that destination. The source, the mock API that I'm using, in your case, it could be like pulling contacts or customers from Shopify. Or maybe you've got a Google form that saves responses in a Google Sheet, and you want to select those rows and send it to HubSpot. So really any data source, we support any API or database. But I'm going to use this mock API. I have endpoint here. Let me copy this path, and we're going to create a new API. So blank REST API, and we will get these mock users. All right, let me name this. And now I'm going to add this one to a table. So we have our HubSpot contacts here in this table. I'm going to make this shorter and add a new table. And then this one will display the records that we're importing. And I think it would probably make more sense to put this one on top, because here's where we're going to select a row and then send it to that destination. So you can see we have a similar issue here with the name and the picture. These are nested fields. It's not flattened. For this table, I showed you how to flatten it with JavaScript. Here, I'm going to do something different. We can use the table widget. So for the name, if I go to the name field here, go into the gear setting for this table column, And I'm going to change this to just name.first. So you can see how the display value changes, the evaluated value here in the table. And if you want, you can also get the last name. So I'm going to turn this into a template literal, put backticks around it, wrap it in the curly braces and a $sign for a variable here. And then we can put a space after it and copy the same thing for the last name. Okay, so that has fixed this one. And then with the picture, this is a object that has properties for the large, medium, and small, thumbnails. I just want to display one of them. So for this picture column, turn this to an image and then tell it to use the large version. All right. So we have flattened the data from both sides. Next, I want to select a row here and then be able to just click a button and send it to HubSpot. So first we'll add that button since we're already here in the table settings. So I can add a new column and I'll just call it save. Change this to an icon button. About the send arrow there. And then when we click it, I need an API that will take data from this row of the table and then send it to HubSpot. So back to the query. We already have this create contact query and it's working, but it's hard coded to that one example here. So I'll take the value from the row where we're clicking that send button. I did not name my tables and I have 2 of them. So let's name this one mock user. I like to use a prefix like this so I know all these widgets with this prefix are tables or inputs or whatever. So I'll call this one table mock users. And then here, table HubSpot. Okay, now we can go fix that query now that I know what table I'm talking about. So we have table mock users where we want to pull the data from. Now, you'll notice the first autocomplete here is the selected row, but you got to be careful because there's a separate triggered row. When you click a button on a table row, that's the triggered row, and it may not be the selected row. The user can click a button on any row of the table widget, and it is not necessarily the selected row, so just be careful. So we're going to use the mock user table. And then go to, that is not auto-completing. Okay, so instead of the selected row, I want the triggered row. There it is. And then we'll get the email from here. And I can copy this that same binding here for the last name, first and last name. So first, oh, and in this case, let's see, it's just name. So I'm going to skip the last name just so we can grab a couple fields. And let's see if this is working now. Notice how it's blank for the evaluated value because no row is being triggered right now. No one's clicking that save button, so there's nothing to send over. But let's go ahead and connect the button. So we go back to the UI. Now I added a button column here, but we can't quite see it. There it is. So I'm going to move this column to the front. And then we'll connect this save button. Make its on click. We want to create a contact. Now, once we do this, it's going to work on the back end. If I click this right now, it will go create that contact, but we won't see a change in the table widget here because we actually have to list the contacts again to rerun that query and see the change happen. If I go look in HubSpot, the record will be there, but Appsmith isn't going to know unless you follow it up with listing the contacts again. So the on click here, instead of just creating the contact, I'm going to use the callback on success to list the contacts again. So if it successfully creates one, then rerun the list. And now we should be able to just click one of these. Let's refresh here. I don't think that took effect yet. Okay, so let's test this out. So you can see this top row is selected, but I'm going to trigger a different row. So that's what you want to be careful of. Just if you're going to use the selected row property, make sure that you're not also combining that with some button that's going to have a triggered row, and they could be different. So looks like it sent it. The table refreshed here, and there it is. The new row is added. All right, awesome. So we were able to take data from this external API, this third-party API, and send it into the HubSpot API just by clicking a button. So if you've got some other system that you want to connect, this is one approach where you can look at each one, kind of give it a review, make sure it's one that you want to import, and then just click a button. Another way we could do this is to bulk transfer them. Maybe you want to select multiple. So on the table widget here, there's an option to select multiple rows. If we go to the row selection here, I'm going to enable multi-row selection. And then what this does, it only lets users select multiple rows. It doesn't do anything other than that until you add some logic and connect some functionality to that. So I've enabled that setting, and now the user could select more than one row. Let me make this short so we can see a few more. But it's not going to do anything yet. It needs some action attached to those selected rows. So I'm going to add a button, and we'll call this Save All. Or Save Selected. All right. Now we want to pass these values to the API and be able to loop over them. So I'm going to copy the query that I have right now for creating a contact. Just want to make another copy of this so I can leave the first one working. And I'm going to call this one bulk create. And the reason we want to format this one a little differently, it's not going to come from the triggered row because we're not triggering a single row now. We want to loop through and do a bunch of them. So I'm going to use parameters to call this, and I'll pass in a parameter for the email and a parameter for the first name. And then we want to access those parameters and loop through and send in new parameters and do the next one and just loop over them like that. So back to our JS. We'll make a function here to bulk upload. And this will need to be an async function. So I want to loop over the selected rows. We'll use a for loop. Row in, let's see, it's table mock users dot selected rows, plural. So there's a selected row, which is an object, and then you can go to selected row dot ID or whatever field. Selected rows will be an array with all of those. So for the row in this set of selected rows, first thing that we want to do is await running that query, create the bulk create, and we'll pass in the row. So for each row here, loop over and run the bulk create API, passing in that row object. And now I have to access that row in the API. So back here, I'm going to take the email from this.params. So this function has a context, this, and when I call it passing in parameters, then this.params, it will be whatever's that object that's getting passed in. So here we can do the same thing with the name. Okay, so I think this is ready to test. I just need a button to trigger that. I've already added the button, I just did not connect it. So the first thing that we'll want to do then is run our function that bulk uploads in a loop. And then we want to see the change down here. And so this time we can't use a callback because we're running a JS function here. If we selected a query, then I can chain them and say on success, do this or that. But since it's a JS object, we should run that extra step here to refresh the table. So we will await, get contacts.run, list contacts. Okay. All right, got 4 rows selected. Let's see what happens. Okay, it looks like it created several rows, but they're all blank. So it went ahead and added a new ID for each one, the date and everything, but it's not catching that parameter that I passed in. Let's check that out. In the JS, I see. It should be for of, because we're looping over a set of rows. I think for in might be for a single object to go over the properties. Let's try for of. Okay. Refresh and make sure this is working. Okay, one more time. Let's test it out. And it looks like it's going. There we go. There's 4 new rows, and it's got the emails and the name. So this will let you bulk select. You could also have a step here that unselects these if you want. We can reset the table widget. So if I come back here, I can make the last step of this, reset widget. And then that would be the table HubSpot. And this takes the text name. So let's try it one more time. I'll unselect that set. And we have a bunch of pages here. We'll just grab a few more random ones. I think I can do it across pages too. Let's try that. Okay. So we want to save these in bulk. Cool. Yeah, it's adding all of them now. So with all of the different data sources that Appsmith supports, you can use this same approach to bulk add records to HubSpot or any other one of our data sources. We support any REST or GraphQL API. We have SAS connectors for HubSpot and Google Sheets and Airtable and just tons of other data sources that you can bridge together. This is one of the most common use cases for Appsmith is just bridging multiple data sources and giving you a central place to access everything and control it. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions on this workshop or ideas for other ones, feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.